The fluorescent lights of Macy's personnel office hummed with the mechanical indifference of post-war America. Outside, 34th Street bustled with the optimism of a nation that had survived depression and war, now hungry for normalcy, for prosperity, for Christmas magic. Inside, a man sat across from Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the store's holiday hiring manager, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his smile warm but measured. "Mr. Volkov, or should I say Mr. Wallace?" Mrs. Hutchins adjusted her cat-eye glasses, reviewing the application form. "Victor Wallace, that's quite a transition from your previous name." "My family anglicized it after the war," Victor replied, his English flawless but carrying the faintest trace of an accent he'd spent 5 years perfecting in a dacha outside Moscow. "We wanted to fit in, to be American, like everyone else who came through Ellis Island." It was a lie constructed with surgical precision. Victor Volkov had never passed through Ellis Island. He'd arrived on a Swedish cargo vessel in 1947, carrying forged papers identifying him as a displaced person from Latvia, one of thousands of refugees absorbed into America's post-war chaos. His real name was Viktor Antonovich Volkov, lieutenant in the NKVD, soon to be reorganized as the KGB, and he'd been selected for this assignment because of 3 rare qualities: patience, linguistic talent, and an extraordinary ability to disappear into plainness. Mrs. Hutchins smiled. "Well, Mr. Wallace, your references are impeccable. The church vouches for you, and Father McMahon speaks highly of your work with the parish community. We need someone reliable for our Santa position. 10 weeks, 6 days a week, sometimes 9 hours a day. Children can be challenging." "I love children," Victor said, and this wasn't entirely a lie. He'd had a daughter once back in Leningrad before the war took her along with so much else. The memory was useful. It gave his smile authenticity, made his eyes crinkle with genuine warmth when parents brought their trembling, hopeful children to sit on Santa's lap. "You'll start after Thanksgiving. Full costume, makeup assistance provided. The pay is modest, but there's something special about being Macy's Santa. You become part of the magic." Mrs. Hutchins extended her hand. Victor shook it, feeling the soft skin of American comfort, so different from the calloused hands of Moscow Center operatives. "I won't let you down." 3 days later, in a rent-controlled apartment in Astoria, Queens, Victor stood before a cracked mirror practicing his ho-ho-ho. The room was sparse. A single bed, a hot plate, a radio that picked up both American stations and, with careful adjustment, a frequency that carried coded messages from a transmitter in Brighton Beach. On the table beside him lay his instructions, memorized and burned 2 months prior. Mission parameters: establish cover as seasonal retail worker. Primary objective: monitor American consumer behavior, economic indicators, and civilian morale. Secondary objective: identify potential recruitment targets among Macy's corporate structure and customer base. Tertiary objective: serve as emergency courier for primary assets operating in Manhattan Financial District. The tertiary objective was what made this assignment critical. Victor wasn't just a spy, he was infrastructure. In the paranoid calculus of early Cold War espionage, the FBI had become increasingly sophisticated at tracking Soviet diplomatic personnel. Traditional methods of contact, dead drops in Central Park, brief encounters at museums, were compromised. But who would suspect Santa Claus? Victor's handler, a woman known only as Sparrow, had been explicit during their final meeting in a Brighton Beach bakery. "You will be invisible because you will be everywhere. Americans trust Santa. They photograph him, confide in him, stand in line for hours to see him. You will become part of their ritual, and in that ritual you will hide." The first day Victor put on the red suit, he felt the transformation. The padding around his waist, the white beard carefully applied by Macy's makeup artist, the black boots. It was a disguise more complete than any forged passport. When he looked in the mirror, Viktor Volkov disappeared entirely, replaced by the archetypal figure of American capitalism and childhood wonder. "You look perfect," the makeup artist, a young woman named Dorothy, said with genuine delight. "The kids are going to love you." The line formed before the store even opened. Mothers clutching the hands of children dressed in their Sunday best, fathers with cameras slung around their necks, siblings pushing and laughing in anticipation. Victor, now Santa, settled into the ornate wooden throne in the center of Macy's holiday display, surrounded by mechanical elves, fake snow, and a backdrop painted to resemble the North Pole. "Ho, ho, ho!" he boomed as the first child approached, a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "And what's your name, little one?" "Susie," she whispered, climbing onto his lap with the help of her mother. "Well, Susie, have you been a good girl this year?" As she recited her Christmas wishes, a doll, a bicycle, peace for her daddy, who still had nightmares about Normandy, Victor listened with trained attention. Not to the wishes themselves, but to the background, the conversations of waiting parents, the complaints about prices, about rationing that had finally ended, about the new television sets that were reshaping American homes. Every detail was intelligence, but the real work began during the lunch breaks. In the employee cafeteria, Victor befriended the security guards, the floor managers, the window dressers. He learned about shipment schedules, about inventory systems, about which executives drank too much at the company Christmas party, and which secretaries had access to confidential files. He was building a map, not of Macy's layout, but of its human vulnerabilities. On his third week, Victor received his first operational tasking. It came embedded in a greeting card purchased by an elderly woman who approached him during a break. "My grandson couldn't make it today," she said in Russian-accented English, handing him the card. "Would you read his letter?" Inside, among childish crayon drawings, was a microdot. That evening, using a jeweler's loupe purchased from a pawn shop, Victor decoded the message. "Package arriving December 15th. Carousel horse, 3rd row. Confirm receipt via ornament protocol." The ornament protocol was elegant in its simplicity. Macy's holiday display included a massive Christmas tree where children could hang decorations. Victor had been given a set of 12 ornaments, each slightly different. By hanging a specific one during his shift, he could signal, "Message received, meeting requested, danger, all clear." To anyone watching, he was just a kindly Santa helping children decorate a tree. December 15th arrived with fresh snow coating Manhattan. The store was packed, the air thick with the scent of roasting chestnuts from street vendors and expensive perfume from the cosmetics counter. Victor worked his usual shift, listening to wishes for chemistry sets and baseball gloves, for fathers to come home from Korea, for mothers to stop crying when they thought no one was watching. At 2:47 p.m., a man in a grey overcoat approached the carousel in the toy department. He placed his hand briefly on the 3rd horse in the 3rd row, a white stallion with a golden mane. Then he moved away, disappearing into the crowd. During his break, Victor retrieved the package, a slim envelope taped beneath the horse's saddle, containing documents that would later prove to be preliminary designs for a new radar system being developed at Bell Laboratories. That night, Victor hung ornament number 7, a silver bell, on the Christmas tree. Message received, package secured. As he walked home through the December cold, passing storefront nativity scenes and Salvation Army bell ringers, Viktor Volkov felt the peculiar loneliness of the deep-cover operative. He was surrounded by millions, yet utterly alone. He brought joy to children while serving an apparatus of state secrecy. He embodied a symbol of generosity while engaged in theft. But this was the work. This was the war that would never be declared, fought not with tanks and bombers, but with patience, deception, and the slow accumulation of secrets hidden in plain sight. And Victor, Santa to thousands, spy to none, had 10 Christmas seasons ahead of him to perfect his craft. The Cold War had come to Herald Square, wrapped in red velvet and holiday cheer, and no one suspected a thing. By his fourth Christmas in the red suit, Victor Wallace had become an institution. Children who'd sat on his lap as toddlers now returned as confident second graders, eager to remind their Santa of promises made and wishes granted. Mothers recognized his particular brand of gentle humor. Even the Macy's management had come to rely on his punctuality, his patience, and his uncanny ability to handle the most difficult children with grace. What none of them knew was that Victor Volkov had transformed Santa's throne into one of the most sophisticated intelligence collection points in New York City. The wish lists that children handed him weren't just adorable artifacts of childhood innocence. They were, in aggregate, a real-time economic survey of American consumer desires, manufacturing trends, and family financial stability. Soviet analysts at Moscow Center had become fascinated by the data Victor provided, recognizing patterns that their own economists had missed. But the wishlist operation was merely cover for Victor's primary function, serving as a communications hub for a network of Soviet illegals operating across Manhattan. The FBI's intensified surveillance following the Rosenberg arrests had made traditional tradecraft increasingly dangerous. The Bureau had eyes on every Soviet diplomat, every known Communist Party member, every bookstore and cultural center where contact might occur, but they had no interest in Macy's Santa Claus. The system Victor had developed was brilliant in its simplicity. Parents would bring their children, wait in line, approach the throne. During those brief moments, 90 seconds on average, entire intelligence operations could be coordinated through a vocabulary of innocuous phrases, subtle gestures, and carefully timed movements. "Has your daughter been good this year?" Victor would ask, his blue eyes twinkling with practiced warmth. "Oh yes, she's been studying her piano very hard. She had a lesson last Tuesday at 3 o'clock. A mother might respond, and with those words, Victor would know that a dead drop had been serviced, that documents had been retrieved, that a contact was clear. The child, meanwhile, would recite her Christmas wishes, oblivious to the adult transaction occurring above her head. The photograph taken by Macy's photographer would capture a moment of holiday magic. The receipt given to the parents would include a claim number for picking up the photo, a number that, to trained eyes, contained additional information encoded in its sequence. In December 1955, the network reached a critical phase. The Soviet Union was accelerating its ballistic missile program, desperate to match American advances in rocketry and nuclear delivery systems. Assets embedded in aerospace companies across the United States were gathering fragments of information. A metallurgy specification here, a guidance system schematic there. But the challenge was aggregation. How do you assemble a complete picture from dozens of sources without creating a centralized vulnerability? The answer sat on a throne in Macy's, wearing a red suit and a belly full of padding. Victor's handler had changed twice since 1952, but the current operative, codenamed Nightingale, was the most demanding. She was younger than Victor, perhaps 30, with the hard efficiency of the post-war generation who'd grown up during the siege of Leningrad and emerged with no illusions about sentiment or safety. They met once a month in a Ukrainian restaurant in the East Village, sitting at separate tables, communicating through a waiter who was himself a low-level asset. "The volume is becoming dangerous," Nightingale had told him during their November meeting, her words delivered via a note tucked into a menu. "FBI counterintelligence is mapping communication patterns. We need to reduce contact frequency while increasing information density." Victor had proposed a solution, the Christmas card program. Macy's encouraged children to write letters to Santa, which were collected in special red mailboxes throughout the store. Victor volunteered to help sort and respond to selected letters, a task that seemed perfectly in character for a dedicated seasonal employee who'd become emotionally invested in his role. What Macy's management didn't know was that certain letters, marked with subtle indicators, contained microdots, coded messages, and coordination instructions for assets across the Northeast. A letter from Timothy in New Jersey about his wish for a model rocket might actually contain specifications for a Soviet R-7 propulsion test. A card from Sarah in Connecticut requesting a nurse's kit could include details about a security weakness at a defense contractor. The brilliance of the system was its deniability. These were children's letters, screened and sorted by a beloved store Santa. Who would think to look closer? But in mid-December, something went wrong. A child named Billy Cooperman, 8 years old, submitted a drawing along with his wish list. Billy's father worked as a draftsman at Grumman Aircraft Engineering, and Billy liked to copy his father's work, creating elaborate technical drawings of airplanes and rockets with surprising accuracy. His submission to Santa included a detailed sketch of what he called his dream plane, which was in fact a recognizable rendering of the F-11 Tiger jet fighter, including propulsion details that were supposed to be classified. Victor recognized the problem immediately. This wasn't intelligence he'd requested. It was a random occurrence, a child's innocent mimicry creating a security breach. If he kept the drawing and it was discovered, questions would be asked. If he ignored it, an opportunity would be lost. And if Billy mentioned his drawing to the wrong person, connections might be made that couldn't be unmade. He made a decision that would haunt him. He kept the drawing, photographed it during his lunch break using a Minox camera concealed in his thermos, then returned the original to Billy's letter, marked it as responded to, and filed it with hundreds of others. The photograph was passed to Nightingale at their next meeting. Moscow Center was delighted. The drawing confirmed several assumptions about the F-11's development and provided details that their other sources had missed. But Victor had violated his own cardinal rule: never let operational activity touch the innocent. Billy Cooperman was 8 years old. His father was a draftsman, not a spy. The drawing was a child's Christmas gift to Santa, not an intelligence product. By weaponizing it, Victor had crossed a line he'd promised himself he'd never approach. The guilt manifested in strange ways. Victor found himself giving Billy's name special attention when the boy visited Santa later that week. He spent extra time with him, asked about school, about hobbies, about his father. Billy, thrilled to have Santa's undivided attention, chattered about his dad's work, about the cool planes being built, about how he wanted to be an engineer someday. "Your father must be very proud of you," Victor said, his voice carrying a weight that Billy couldn't possibly understand. "You're a good boy, a very good boy." That night, Victor stood in his Astoria apartment, looking at himself in the mirror without the beard, without the suit, seeing Victor Volkov again instead of Santa Claus. He thought about his daughter, lost in the siege of Leningrad, who would have been about Billy's age now if she'd survived. He thought about the children he entertained daily, their faces filled with hope and trust, and he thought about the apparatus he served, which would use anything, even a child's drawing, to gain advantage in a war that couldn't be won, only endured. But there was no room for sentiment in this work. The next morning, Victor returned to Macy's, put on the red suit, applied the white beard, and became Santa Claus again. The line of children stretched through the toy department, each one carrying wishes and dreams, and the innocent belief that a kind old man in a red suit could make the world right. And for 90 seconds at a time, Victor tried his best to make that belief real, even as he used it to serve a cause that viewed such innocence as merely another exploitable resource in the long, cold struggle for the future. Special Agent Margaret Chen had developed a reputation within the FBI's New York field office for seeing connections that others missed. At 32, she was one of the few women working counterintelligence, a role she'd earned through a combination of linguistic skill, analytical brilliance, and the kind of persistent attention to detail that drove her male colleagues to both admiration and irritation. She spoke Mandarin, Russian, and German fluently, had a degree in mathematics from Radcliffe, and possessed the particular kind of mind that found patterns in chaos. Which was why, on a grey March afternoon in 1958, she was sitting in a windowless office reviewing what most of her colleagues considered garbage, intercepted communications that were too innocuous to be obviously coded, too mundane to warrant investigation, too numerous to fully analyze. Letters to Santa Claus were buried in one such pile. The case had started with Billy Cooperman's father, though Special Agent Chen didn't know it yet. Thomas Cooperman, the Grumman draftsman, had been interviewed as part of a routine security review following a minor breach at the company. During the interview, he'd mentioned his son's fascination with aircraft, his tendency to copy technical drawings, and, almost as an afterthought, how Billy had submitted one such drawing to Santa at Macy's the previous Christmas. The interviewing agent had noted it as a potential security concern, classified information, even in childish sketch form, leaving a controlled environment. The note had been filed, reviewed, and ultimately dismissed. After all, what were the odds that Soviet intelligence was monitoring children's letters to Santa Claus? But Margaret Chen had a different perspective. She'd been studying Soviet intelligence methodology with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and she understood something her colleagues often missed. The KGB didn't think like Americans. They had patience that spanned decades. They built networks that looked nothing like traditional espionage. They hid not in shadows, but in plain sight, using the very openness of American society as camouflage. When she saw the note about Billy Cooperman's drawing, something clicked. She requested all security reviews from defense contractors in the New York area for the past 5 years. Then she did something unusual. She cross-referenced them with major retail establishments' hiring records, looking for any point of intersection. It took 3 weeks of analysis, working late into the night in an office that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. But gradually, a pattern emerged. Employees or family members of employees at 16 different defense contractors had all visited Macy's Herald Square during the Christmas season between 1952 and 1957. By itself, this meant nothing. Macy's was an institution. Millions of people visited during the holidays. But when she overlaid this data with other factors, dates of known dead drop servicing, timing of intelligence leaks, patterns of surveillance that had yielded nothing, the coincidence became uncomfortable. She brought her analysis to her supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Robert Driscoll, a veteran of World War II counterintelligence who'd helped break German spy rings during the war. Driscoll listened patiently as Margaret presented her findings, his face impassive. "You're suggesting," he said finally, "that Macy's Santa Claus is a Soviet spy." "I'm suggesting that there's a statistical anomaly worth investigating," Margaret replied carefully. "Multiple families connected to defense work, visiting the same location during a compressed time frame in a pattern that correlates with known intelligence activity." Driscoll tapped his pen against the desk. "Do you know how this will sound to the director? Santa Claus as a KGB operative? It sounds like something out of a bad radio drama." "Which is exactly why it might be real," Margaret countered. "Sir, think about it. We've been watching diplomatic channels, monitoring known sympathizers, tracking every obvious avenue. But what if they're using something we'd never look at because it seems too absurd?" After a long silence, Driscoll made a decision that would define the next phase of the investigation. "Find out who plays Santa at Macy's. Background check, full workup, but quiet. If you're wrong, this stays buried. If you're right." He didn't finish the sentence. The personnel records revealed that Macy's used the same Santa for 6 consecutive years. Victor Wallace, resident of Astoria, Queens. Clean record, good references, church-going, active in his community. Naturalized citizen, arrived 1947 as a displaced person from Latvia. The file was almost too perfect. Margaret Chen requested a more detailed background investigation. Immigration records showed Victor Wallace entering through a displaced persons program that had been notoriously porous. Thousands of refugees had been processed with minimal vetting in the chaos of post-war reconstruction. The church reference came from Father McMahon, who died in 1955. Previous employers listed in his work history turned out to be businesses that had closed or never existed. The man who called himself Victor Wallace appeared to have materialized fully formed in 1947, with a past that dissolved into vagueness whenever examined too closely. "We need surveillance," Margaret told Driscoll. "Full coverage, but careful. If he's operational, he'll be watching for tails." The FBI began monitoring Victor Wallace in April 1958. They watched him leave his apartment each morning, take the subway to various odd jobs. He worked as a department store clerk, a seasonal tax preparer, a night watchman at a warehouse. He lived modestly, had few friends, attended church irregularly, and seemed to be exactly what he appeared, a quiet immigrant trying to build a life in America. But Margaret noticed details others missed. The warehouse where Victor worked night shifts was in Brighton Beach, in the heart of a Russian émigré community. His subway routes often took him through stations where dead drops had previously been serviced. His attendance at a Ukrainian restaurant in the East Village correlated with dates when other surveillance operations had noted unusual activity. Margaret Chen faced a decision that went beyond law enforcement. They could arrest Victor Wallace tomorrow, hold a public trial, expose the network, and score a major propaganda victory in the Cold War struggle. Or they could continue watching, using his network to feed disinformation, turning his channels into tools for American intelligence. But there was a third option, one that Margaret had been considering privately for weeks. They could let him walk away. Victor Wallace, after all, was no longer really working for the Soviet Union. He'd become something else, a man trapped between two identities, serving neither effectively, useful to no one except the children who sat on his lap and believed for 90 seconds in magic. The decision wasn't Margaret's alone to make. That evening, in a secure conference room in the FBI's New York field office, senior officials from the Bureau, the CIA, and the National Security Council convened to determine Viktor Volkov's fate. Margaret presented her analysis, walking them through the evidence, the network diagram, the assessment of current threat level. "The question," she concluded, "is whether the intelligence value of keeping him in place outweighs the security risk he represents and the propaganda value of prosecution." There was silence as the officials considered options. Finally, James Angleton from CIA counterintelligence, legendary for his paranoia and his conviction that Soviet intelligence had penetrated every major Western institution, spoke. "He's more valuable as a known quantity than as a prisoner. We control what he knows, we shape what he reports, we use his network to understand Moscow Center's intelligence priorities. Keep him in place, but quarantined. Let him believe he's operational, but everything he touches is monitored, controlled, turned to our purposes." It was decided. Victor Wallace would continue his work, would return to Macy's for an 11th season, would maintain his cover and his contacts. But he would do so inside a carefully constructed reality, one where every piece of intelligence he gathered was either useless or deliberately fed to him, where every contact was monitored, where his entire operational existence had become, without his knowledge, a tool of American counterintelligence. 3 days before Christmas, Victor received a communication from his handler. The method was traditional, a classified ad in the New York Times that, when decoded, provided meeting instructions. He took the subway to Brighton Beach, walked 3 blocks through the December cold, and entered a Russian bookstore that served as a safe meeting location. Tatiana, Nightingale, was waiting in the back room, and Victor immediately knew something was wrong. Her face, usually controlled and professional, showed strain, dark circles under her eyes, tension in her shoulders, the signs of an operative under pressure. "Moscow Center has concerns," she said without preamble, "about your reliability, about whether you've become too attached to your cover identity." Victor felt something cold settle in his chest. "My work speaks for itself. I've provided valuable intelligence for a decade. Intelligence that has become increasingly unfocused, more about American society, less about specific technical or military targets. You've become an anthropologist, Victor, not a spy." He wanted to deny it, but couldn't. She was right. Somewhere over 10 years, Viktor Volkov had become fascinated by the country he was supposed to be subverting. The resilience of American democracy, the genuine warmth of strangers, the way a society could absorb millions of immigrants and somehow remain coherent. These weren't intelligence priorities, but they'd come to dominate his thinking. "What does Moscow want?" he asked finally. "They want to know if you're still one of us. They want proof of commitment." She slid a thin envelope across the table. "There's a new tasking, time-sensitive. Execute it successfully and all doubts will be resolved." Victor opened the envelope, read the instructions, and felt the last remnants of Viktor Volkov collapse under the weight of what he'd become. The tasking required him to compromise an individual he'd come to know over the years. A Macy's executive who'd treated him with kindness, who'd given him bonuses, who'd attended his naturalization ceremony when Victor Wallace officially became an American citizen. The intelligence would be valuable, the method straightforward, and the execution would destroy a decent man's life. He looked at Tatiana, Nightingale, and understood that she already knew his answer. Maybe she'd known for years. Maybe Moscow Center knew too, and this was their way of forcing a choice that would resolve one way or another. "I need time to think," Victor said. "You have until December 26th, Tatiana replied. "After that, decisions will be made for you." Victor walked back through Brighton Beach, through neighborhoods that felt like transplanted pieces of Russia, past stores where Russian was spoken more than English, where old men played chess and argued about politics in a homeland most would never see again. He thought about identity, about loyalty, about the question of who he actually was after 10 years of performance. That night in his Astoria apartment, Viktor Volkov made a choice that would end one life and begin another. He didn't contact the FBI. That would have been betrayal of a different kind. He didn't inform Moscow Center of his decision. That would have been pointless. Instead, he simply stopped. He set down the tools of espionage, the codes and protocols and procedures, and he let Viktor Volkov die quietly, without drama or ceremony. On December 26th, Victor Wallace submitted his resignation to Macy's, citing health concerns. He moved to a small town in upstate New York, where he opened a bookstore and lived quietly for the next 23 years. The FBI watched him for 18 months before concluding he'd become inactive, a burned-out former asset no longer worth monitoring. Moscow Center eventually wrote him off as compromised or dead, a casualty of the long intelligence war. The network he'd served collapsed within 2 years, rolled up by the FBI in a series of quiet arrests that never made headlines. Tatiana, Nightingale, was exchanged for an American asset in 1965. The other illegals were either expelled or imprisoned, their lives and work vanishing into classified files that would stay sealed for decades. But for 10 Christmas seasons, Viktor Volkov had been the most unlikely spy in Cold War history, a Soviet intelligence officer who became, despite every intention, genuinely American by the simple act of pretending to be Santa Claus. The children who sat on his lap never knew they were part of an intelligence operation. The parents who treasured their Santa photographs never suspected the man in the red suit was anything other than what he appeared to be. And perhaps, in the end, they were right. Because whatever Viktor Volkov had been when he arrived in 1947, by 1962 he'd been transformed by the very cover identity he'd been assigned to inhabit. The mask had become the face, the performance had become the reality, and the spy had become, in the most fundamental sense, the person he'd only pretended to be. Margaret Chen, who'd spent 4 years hunting him, understood this in a way her colleagues never quite grasped. Years later, after the Cold War ended and files were declassified, she would write in her private notes, "We never caught Viktor Volkov. He simply stopped existing, replaced entirely by Victor Wallace." In the end, the most successful American counterintelligence operation wasn't an arrest or an exposure. It was the slow, inadvertent conversion of an enemy agent into exactly what he'd been pretending to be all along. The Cold War would continue for another 27 years after Victor Wallace retired from Macy's. The intelligence services would refine their methods, the technology would advance, the stakes would remain existentially high. But never again would Soviet intelligence attempt to hide an operative in such an unlikely role, because the lesson had been learned. Some covers are too perfect, too complete, too real to maintain without being transformed by them. In the archives of both the FBI and the KGB, Viktor Volkov's file remains classified to this day, a reminder that the most dangerous thing about deep cover operations isn't the secrets they steal, but the identities they create, and the human capacity to become, authentically and irrevocably, someone entirely different from who we once were. The children who visited Macy's Santa between 1952 and 1962 are grandparents now, many of them still treasuring faded photographs of a kind man in a red suit. They never knew they were sitting on the lap of a Soviet spy. Perhaps it's better that way. Because the magic they experienced was real, even if everything else was performance. And in the end, that magic, the genuine human connection that occurred despite the deception, was the only thing about the operation that mattered, the only thing that lasted, the only thing that was true.